Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. This is the latest in our series of how to play videos, and we've done what I would call the big three. We've already done the French, the British and the Russians, so we're going to start with the next one, which is the Austrians. Now interestingly, the Austrians, I think, if you've seen any of my best units in the game videos recently, I think the Austrians are actually an incredibly strong army, and they're also quite popular amongst collectors and gamers as well, and I think that's for a number of reasons. The first one being they were Napoleon's most implacable enemy. Right back from the revolutionary days through to the start of the empire and then right through to the end, most of the time you could find some Austrians at war with them. A lot of you will know that the 1809 campaign is actually one of my favourite campaigns, also known as the Danube Campaign, and that was solely a French versus Austrian, although there were some Bavarians involved as well. But it was a French versus the Austrians, and I think that's an absolutely fantastic campaign, because it's got a lot of things going on. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't actually have rules for the campaign. I'm hoping to do a video in the not-too-distant future where we look at what we might want from a supplement for the 1809, and also the early 1805 campaign as well. That involved the Austrians and the Russians taking an alliance in that one. But what we've got at the moment are the rules for the Austrians in 1812. Now, there had been some quite large reforms in 1808, which was a big thing in the 1809 campaign, but they're very different to the Austrians from 1805 or 1800 in the Battle of Marengo, or even the earlier campaigns than that. So it is worth bearing in mind that in today's video, we are going to be looking at late Austrians, I'm going to call them. So these ones sort of cover the 1809 campaign. I'm going to talk about a unit that's not in the book and ideas of how we could get that going forward. But we're also looking at the Austrians when they fought alongside the French in 1812, and then how they fought against the French in the campaigns of 1813 and 14. Now, as always, we're going to divide the army into two videos. This one is going to be the infantry video, and then in the not-too-distant future, hopefully, then we'll have the cavalry video as well. So, cracking open my Clash of Eagles book to page 66, we start the Austrian chapter there. And the first thing, although I know that I said this one's going to be about infantry, but for the first one, I'm just going to talk about their special rules. The first one is their commanders. Now, Austrian commanders were perhaps not the best. Let's put it that way. There are some exceptions, but by and large, they were not great. So they have a less likely chance of being good independently, and that means that they're less likely to be able to order those massive attacks that make for good aggressive armies. And that follows on to the fact that they can't issue brigade orders. They can only issue regimental orders, and that means that you can only issue a group order. So for argument's sake, these two units will charge with the, this unit will charge with the second unit in support or whatever like that, but you can only do that for two battalions of the same regiment. Now, the Austrians only had two field battalions per regiment, so that basically limits you to only being able to command two units at a time. And that means, that can ultimately lead to attacks going in unsupported or uncoordinated, and obviously that's a huge problem if you're trying to attack a large formation of the enemy. One slight difference to this is Grenadier Brigades. They can be issued with brigade orders, but they have to be very close to each other, and that I think is quite a nice change, because the elite Grenadiers, they were considered elite and they were grouped together as a reserve, so it gives you a more reliable reserve, and I think that's good both historically and on the tabletop as well. So speaking of the quality of the Grenadiers, let's get into the individual units. Now, the roster for the Austrians is actually not very big. There's only 4 different types of units, and if we were to play the 1809 campaign, there would be a 5th one. That would be Landwehr. Now, Landwehr aren't very good. Austrian Landwehr, particularly poor. I would use the same rules for the Opolcheni, that's the Russian militia. I'd use the same rules as them for the Austrian Landwehr. Job done. I think we don't need to talk about them anymore, but I'll talk more about them when I do the video on what I would like to see in an 1809 book. So the 4 different types of infantry unit we have are line infantry, Grenzer, or Grens Infantry, Jaegers, and the Grenadiers. The line infantry are just your bog standard infantry. They've got hand-to-hand 6, shooting 3, morale 4, and stamina 3. So they're just same as anyone else, really. They do have poor mixed formation, which doesn't really matter in Black Powder version 2. It used to be that the skirmishers would get +1 to hit, but they don't anymore in Black Powder anyway. So either that rule needs rewriting, or just you can ignore it altogether. I may have an idea of how you can rewrite that, but I'll mention that in a future video. So far, so standard, whatever. But it's also worth pointing out that you can take them in large units. Now, Austrian infantry battalions were absolutely humongous, way in excess of 1,000 men usually. So they absolutely should be taken as large units as much as possible, in my opinion. I think that really does show them on the tabletop. And also, when you've got 48 dudes in the white uniforms and different facings, and that crucial 2 colours, then I think they look absolutely phenomenal. So when you can, I would almost always take Austrian battalions as large battalions. If they suffered heavy casualties, they would be more likely to amalgamate 2 line battalions into 1 unit than have 2 smaller sized ones. So you can absolutely have a historical reason and a tactical reason to go for large infantry units. Now, they also have a second special rule as well, which is, and I'm going to absolutely butcher the German here, it is Flintenkartage. Kartage? Something like that, I don't know. I told you I was going to butcher it, but there you go. Basically what it is it's 3 pistol balls that they would fire in 1 volley. Now, the rules, I mean, they're not quite pistol balls, but they are smaller caliber than their normal musket balls. Now, in the rules, this means that for the first time a battalion fires at close range, they get to fire an extra dice. So if you're a large infantry battalion, you would normally be firing 4 dice that hit on a 3 because you get +1 for being at close range. You would be firing 5 dice. Now, I've said this quite a lot. This is a phenomenal rule. The amount of firepower an Austrian battalion can kick out is absolutely horrendous for an attacking French player. Trust me, I've done it quite a few times. Now, the thing is with the 5 dice, you're not necessarily looking at doing a huge amount of damage, because that French infantry battalion is going to have a 3+ save if they've watched the How to Play French video and they're in the attack column. Then the chances of you completely annihilating that unit are actually pretty low. But when you're fishing for that 6, it's really, really strong. And the key is, when that French infantry battalion charges you, and you roll that 6, they can't stop the charge. They carry on the charge, and now they're hitting you on a 4+ in close combat. They effectively lose that charge bonus. And all of a sudden, because you're a large battalion and they're just a regular one, you've got 8 hand-to-hand dice. They've only got 6. It's a whole new type of combat, and the chances of the French winning that are actually pretty low. Now, I mentioned there that you only get that when you're firing at point-blank range or close range. So there's 2 ways that you can do that. Obviously, you can advance the unit into close range of the enemy, or you can do it as a charge reaction. Because you've got that low independence rating, and you don't have access to strategy rating 9 generals, I would suggest that the best way of doing that is in defensive fire. Now, something that makes it better than, say, the British first fire is that you can blaze away for the entire game, and you only use that rule when the enemy charge you, effectively. So that means that you don't have to decide when you're going to use it, when's going to be the optimum time to use it, because you're almost told when you're going to use it by the enemy charging you. For the British, it's a little bit different. They use their first fire the first time they fire. So they may be tempted to hold their fire until the enemy charge them, or they get in that close range. I advise against that, but there are some commanders out there that believe you should hold your fire until you see the whites of the enemy's eyes. Not so for the Austrians. Blaze away with your 4 dice from your large battalion, and then when the enemy gets close, you get to chuck in that cheeky extra 5th one. They also have a special rule that's one of their formations. That's the battalion or divisional mass. I'm going to talk about that at the end because quite a few different units get that. So we're now going to move on to the second type of infantry, and these are effectively the Austrian light infantry. So the same as the Leger or the British Light Infantry, and these are the Grens. Now, the Grens are one of my favourite units. I really, really like the Grenser. They were tough mountain troops that fought on the borders with the Ottoman Empire, so we're talking Serbians, Croats, Bosnians. Bosnians tended to be in the Ottoman Empire, but that area around there, particularly Serbians, and those guys would fight quite a lot. They'd be quite experienced veterans. Because of that, they gained tough fighter, but they also have unreliable. They were quite good fighting small actions, but their battlefield performance never really lived up to the hype, I guess you could say, because they were more used to fighting those small-scale battles. Now, they also have mixed formation and skirmish. So if you are wanting to throw out a skirmish screen in front of your troops, you can do a lot worse than the Grenser, particularly as they have rifle mixed formation. So this is one of your rifle formations. They are not bad for it, to be honest. You just need to be careful because of the unreliable. So I would suggest that you use them in one of two ways. Firstly, you can use them as a front line against the enemy. Now, they do have the Flinten Cartouche as well, so they do get to use that. So they get a fourth shot when they're in standing and shooting, although you can take them as a large unit as well, so you can have them as that fifth one. But the unreliable is something of a concern. I think they're much better used in reserve, so your second line troops, because it doesn't matter the quality of the troops who give you that +1 to your combat resolution for a supporting infantry unit. They can be the most rubbish troops on the planet, but as long as they're there, they give you that +1. If the enemy do manage to break through that front line of line units and they get into the Grenser, well, the Grenser aren't terrible, they're just not as good as the line troops. Them being unreliable means that they have to take a morale test every time they take a casualty. Now, if you're the French, if I've just broken through the front line of the Austrians and all I've got is Grenser behind me, I'm probably just going to charge. I'm probably not going to try and engage you in a musketry duel. Therefore, that unreliable thing becomes less important because you're going to be in combat anyway. If you win the combat, you don't need to test. If you lose the combat, well, you're going to have to test anyway. So it doesn't actually make any difference. That's why, for me, I'd have them in that second line. Remember, they also get the extra stand and shoot dice. So the French, he's charged in, he's taken his 5 dice on the way in. He's fought his combat against 8 hand-to-hand dice. Somehow he's managed to defeat that first battalion. He's now got to do the same thing again against the Grensers. I think having them as a skirmish unit is, it's good, don't get me wrong, but I think it can lead you it can lay a little bit of a trap for you. You can see them like you would use, say, British Light Infantry or French Leger. You can see them as a swarm in front of your unit, but that unreliable, you're only one bad dice roll away from losing an entire unit. I mean, I can shoot my French at you, my French attack column, he gets 1 dice, it fires a shot, the wound gets through, and if you roll a 4 or less, you are destroyed. So that's what, 4's got 1, 2, 3 outcomes, so that's 6 out of 36. So you've got a 1 in 6 chance of your unit just completely evaporating from that rando extra shot that my attack column just threw out there. So be aware of that. I would tend not to use Grenser in a skirmishing role. There is, however, one very, very big exception to this, well, 2 I guess, and that would be if you're putting them in woods or in buildings. If you're using them as genuine skirmish troops, then I would absolutely go for it, because they're so less likely to take that hit in the first place. If you've got them in a building, then you've got a 2+ save. If they're in the woods, they're -1 to be hit, and they've got +1 to their save. So in that situation, if you're using them to hold an area of strategic importance like that, then absolutely go large. They're probably better than the line troops to do it. But with the removal of poor skirmishers, then at the moment, there's no real reason to use them. I'm just having a quick flick through the army list. Because they've got that negative special rule, I'm just seeing how many points they are. They are, let's have a look. This is really good radio, I'm sure. They are 43 points for a large battalion, as opposed to 48. So they get a 5-point reduction, which is around about 11%. So that's not terrible. I would be tempted to have them in the army. Now, you can remove the reliable if you're using the points by paying an extra 3 points per unit. But if you're going to have them as a second line anyway, I probably wouldn't bother, if I'm honest. I have to say, though, I do have a little bit of a soft spot for the Grenzer. I really like their sort of brown jackets and their blue breech trousers. I think they're with the Hungarian knot on them. I think they're super cool. I've got some, or I had some Foundry ones. I'm not sure if I sold them. I think I did in the end. But no, they're really cool. Really like the Grenzers. I think they've got a place in the army, particularly as a second line. My suggestion would be, don't fall into a trap of thinking that they're going to be skirmishes in front of your main line. Just because they've got skirmish doesn't necessarily mean that they have to use it. One thing I should say is that they do have my favourite rule in the game. I can't believe I missed out on this. They do have Tough Fighter, so that is reroll one failed hit in close combat. Again, I like it. I think it's a great rule, as you know, but I think it can be a little bit of a trap, because if you have them in the front line, it's a good rule to have. I would be tempted as a French commander to not even let them use it. I'd be tempted just to hit them with artillery and just wait for that 1 in 6 chance when you roll that 4 or less and the unit just evaporates. Another reason to have them in the second line is it, as I said, if the French manage to break through the first line, they're probably not going to have the stamina remaining to then start a musketry duel with your second line. You're just going to want to throw your troops in and get into combat. Therefore, that Tough Fighter suddenly becomes that extra obstacle that you've got to overcome in order to get through them. I think they're a great unit, and I'd definitely be looking at adding one to a brigade if you can. So the third type of unit, speaking of skirmishers, are the Jaegers. Now, these Jaegers are they're very similar to Prussian Jaegers in that they have the rifle equipment, and they are out-and-out skirmishers. So they're very similar to the British Rifles as well. But the difference there is they are actually a battalion-sized unit, and they are mixed order formation. So I've mentioned in some of the videos in the past, I've kind of changed my thinking on how I put together mixed order units. So things like the Bashi Basooks and things like that. Units that would always form a skirmish screen. I do think they would have a main core that would be formed up that you can rotate the skirmishing companies out of and things like that. The Brunswick OL would be another example that we've been talking about recently. So I'd probably have 12 guys formed up and then 12 in skirmish screen, and they fire 2 or 3 dice, the third dice being from the rifles. And again, you know, they're not a bad skirmish formation. Now, these guys do have Sharpshooter, and that has gone over to Black Powder Volume 2, so they do have that, or Version 2, I should say. So they do have that advantage. It means they can reroll a miss, which is really, really good. These guys are your traditional skirmishers, but they aren't that many in number. One of the things with the Austrians is, and this is historical as well as on the tabletop, they do have a real dearth of good skirmishers. Now, compared to the French, who have skirmishers coming out of their ear holes, they can really put them at a disadvantage. And when we get into looking at the How to Use Austrian Cavalry video, then we'll look at some ways of countering enemy skirmishers. Hint, it involves cavalry. Spoiler alert there. But so the Jaegers, really good skirmish troops. The fact they've got rifles is particularly good, but they are very few in number, and if you're going to use orders of battle, you won't see them that often. If you're going to use points, then they are very expensive as well. They're 40 points, but that's only for a regular sized unit, so you want to watch out for those guys. Those are your individual skirmisher units. I would use those over the Grenzer, but you know, if you need to have extra support, then use the Grenzer as well. Again, another example would be putting them in buildings. I think the Jaeger could be really good in the front of a built-up area with the Grenzer behind, providing them some support. Not in the rules-wise, but just, you know, in the actual terms of the game. You've got to get through the Jaegers, then you've got to get through that Grenzer battalion as well. So I think that's the main use of the Jaegers. Use them as you would riflemen. Use them as skirmishers. Try and fish for those sixes. and try and stop those French attack columns and just break up that attack. We're going to get more into breaking up French attacks in a second. And finally, for discussing the troop types, because the Austrians don't have any guard units in the field, which I always think is a bit of a shame, because Austrian guards look pretty sweet, actually. But their final unit are the Grenadiers. Now, the Grenadiers are Grenadiers, as the name suggests. They've got hand-to-hand 7, so they've got 1 extra on a normal line battalion, and they've got reliable and elite 4+. Now, elite 4+ is very, very high. A French combined Grenadier battalion only has elite 5+, so they're elite amongst the elites. And they've also got reliable as well, which makes them very good for having that what's the word I'm trying to think of, really? For having them in a supporting role, but in more of a gap plugging role. Because you can also order multiple Grenadier units with 1 brigade order as well, but they have to be within 6 inches of each other in order to do that. Because they are in Battalion Mass, they get +1 to be ordered, but you're only going to be really looking at strategy rating 7, perhaps 8, so that goes up to 8 or 9. So they're still not amazing. Now, there's one special rule I've not talked about yet at the moment, and it's a negative Austrian special rule, and that is to do with their initiative moves. They don't have the lacking initiative special rule. They've got their own unique one, and it means that they can change formation when they are in initiative range, but they can't advance or retreat. Now, one of the things I would have said with the Flintenkarsch special rule is that it would make sense to me to rotate the units around. So you've used it on the first unit. You can only use it once per unit. They then fall back, a little bit like in Zulu. You fire your volley, then you fall back behind the other battalion, then they get to use it as well. That's something you could do with your Grenzer, if you do want to put them in that skirmish role. But remember, you would have to order them to do that. And Austrian commanders are not particularly good at ordering. So, for me, the risk outweighs the reward. The same with the Austrian Grenadiers. If you have them as a reserve, usually one of the great things about having a reserve is that the enemy's within 12 inches of it, so you don't have to make those command rolls. You can automatically charge them in, or change formation and deliver fire, or do whatever it is you want to do with them. With the Austrians, that's not the case. If the enemy is within initiative range, you still have to roll for them. So just bear that one in mind, because it's particularly important with the Grenadiers. The Grenadiers, you want to make initiative charges. You want, as to go through the example earlier on, the French have smashed through the first line. They've smashed through the second line. Now they've got to face the third and final line, the Grenadiers, the Triarii at the back, and they're going to be absolutely boned. Well, that's fine, but if you're in Battalion Mass and you want to charge that now exhausted French infantry unit, then there's a reasonable chance that you're not actually going to be able to. So just bear that in, not because they're disordered, because they've got elite 4+, but just because you're going to fail the command roll. So just be aware of that. So having looked at the individual units, how do they play as an army? Well, there's one key word, and that is defensively. Now, historically, the Austrians could attack, but they often didn't. They often were defensively minded. Wagram is an obvious example of that, and to an extent Austerlitz as well, but they could attack as they did at Aspern-Essling. So, yes, I think it's a little unfair that they are deemed so defensively, because they've got the no initiatives to charge, they've got the low strategy rating, they've got the inability to order brigades as one. So those three things combined, in addition to their absolutely devastating defensive fire, suggests to me that Austrian infantry should really be used as a defensive bulwark. If you're playing, for argument's sake, an Austerlitz battle, I think it'd be really interesting, because you've got a very strong defensive line in the Austrians, and then you've got some not bad attacking options in the Russians. Not great, but not terrible. I think they'll have to put some special rules in there if and when they finally get around to doing an Austerlitz book. But the idea here is that the Austrians, you want to get them on a hill, you want to get them in line, and you want to get the French to come onto you. That's basically it. There's not a massive amount of super strategy that goes into this. This is particularly shown when we played the Wagram game with General Andy, and little General Andy, who could not stop rolling sixes against me. It was very frustrating. But yeah, so you've got an example on the channel of a battle where the Austrians form up in line and they're very, very difficult to shift. Now that's not always possible though. Sometimes the Austrian player has to attack, either locally in a counter-attack or because the scenario needs them to. So for argument's sake, if you're playing Aspern-Essling, then the Austrian player has to attack. So how can you do that? Well, this is where we come to the Battalion Mass. I said that we'd circle back to it, and indeed we have. It's effectively an attack column with extra special rules for forming square. It basically means that you can't stop them by threatening them with cavalry like you could, for argument's sake, a French battalion. This is particularly good news because that's usually the best way of breaking up an attack. Now, I'm going to have a separate video on breaking up attacks, but a really good way is get that unit in square and suddenly either you're staggering the enemy attack or potentially even stopping it altogether. But that's not really a viable tactic against the Battalion Mass because they can still move forward. They do take extra hits from artillery, but as far as breaking up an attack goes, you can still do it in Battalion Mass. Therefore, I would say, in addition to you getting reliable, I would always suggest that you put your attacking troops in Battalion Mass, very similar to the French. I can see very few reasons why you would form line if you're attacking. However, I would try and get the enemy to attack you if possible. They're in a built-up area or behind an obstacle or something like that. The French player's probably not going to attack you. But you can duel with them musketry-wise because you've got that fourth shot from having a large battalion, and you've got the potential to have a fifth if you get up close and personal, then you can out-musket duel them. This is one of the few times where I would be tempted to move to within musket range, blaze away, then I would move forward. Now remember, you can't do this on initiative, you're going to have to order your troops to do this, but move forward and fire at point-blank range. That's because if you fail the order to move, unless it's a blunder, and let's be honest, that does happen, but it's quite rare, then there's nothing lost by failing the order. So you say, right, I'm going to advance forward 1 and deliver fire at the enemy. So you roll, for argument's sake, 10. You can't do it. Well, it doesn't matter. You're still in musketry range. You still get to fire from where you are, and you get to have another go next turn. All right, you've forgone the opportunity to rally or something like that, but, you wouldn't have got that rally off by rolling that 10 anyway. So you can mix it with the French. I would be tempted to move forward in Battalion Mass, then form line and start firing at the French. The French player is then going to have to assault you, and that's exactly what you want him to do. You want him to charge you, get to within that point-blank range, and fire. Just remember, though, you only get that extra dice, that fifth dice, you only get it the first time you use that special rule. So once you've used it, you may just want to either drop back a little bit with that unit. Again, you're going to have to order them to do that. Or you can just go forward, but just know you're not going to get that fifth dice from being at point-blank range. At that point, you're probably best off standing a little further back and just trading fire with the French that way. This is actually a time that I would be tempted to throw the Grenzer into the front line because they've got that skirmish screen. Just remember, be aware that unless you've paid for the upgrade, there is a chance that a single musket shot could make that entire battalion explode. So be very, very careful if you're putting those Grenzer on the front line. So that's it for today's video. Now, there's not a huge amount more to say. They've got a very limited roster of units, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. I like the fact that you get a really strong theme by putting an Austrian army on the table. And as I said before, they look absolutely incredible. I want to say a big thank you to General Dan. He's provided the pictures of the units today, the well-painted ones, they're Dan's. So thank you very much to him for that. We will be doing a video on Austrian cavalry coming up. I've also got the final part on the Prussians coming up. And we will look at a Wednesday. I've got a couple of ideas. I'm not sure which one I'll do yet. But stay tuned for that. Now, I'm going to ask this on Wednesday as well. I know not many people really make it to the end of the videos, so thank you very much to everyone who has. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't enjoyed it, well, thank you very much for listening to half an hour of stuff that you've not enjoyed. But what I'm going to start asking people to do is, I get a lot of my images off the internet. I'm going to ask people, can you send me pictures of your collection to use in the videos? So they don't necessarily have to match the subject we're talking about, but I just think it's a really cool way of getting some lovely painted armies on the channel. Mine can only go so far. They're not that well painted, and we've seen them all a million times. So the best way to do that is either email me at the Napoleonic Wargamer@gmail.com, or send them to me on the Facebook page and on the Messenger, and I can get them that way as well. Remember, I'm having a break in August this year, so I'll probably start using those pictures when we come back in September. We've got a special themed month in October. I'm super excited about that one. And then obviously we've got to run into Christmas and things like that. So please send me your pictures. I'd love to see them, and I'd love to get them on the channel as well. Obviously, I'm going to credit you, and well, it's a good way of getting your troops out there and all that hard work and effort that you've put in, getting some appreciation. If you've got a page yourself, then let me know, and I'll link that in the description. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.